interviews since 2005 as director of the T. Harry Williams Center for Oral History. Partnering with researchers, faculty, staff, and community groups, Cramer helps facilitate new projects each year throughout the state. Cramer's particular research interests includes veterans' histories, the dynamics of community collaboration, and the intersections of trauma and oral history. Cramer serves as the media review editor for the Oral History Review from 2010 to 2018, and as a council member for OHA from 2016 to 2020, where she has been a member since 2000. She is also chair of the LSU Libraries Wellness Committee, serves as a member of on the LSU Superfund Community Engagement Advisory Committee, and the LGBT plus Archives Oral History Committee, among others. In the fall of 2020, Cramer will be teaching a seminar through the LSU Honors College on oral history and the Louisiana Veterans Experience. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my dear friend, Jen Cramer.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming today, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to come and speak. So everybody has a story to tell, and today I'm going to tell a little story about oral history, community, and collaboration. Telling stories is a pivotal part of the human experience. It's how we transmit information about our external world. It's how we transmit information about our cultural values, traditions, and history. And I'm so excited to see you here today because that means you have a curiosity about the history and the stories of Mossville, Louisiana. And so I'd like you to take that same curiosity, kind of turn it inward and think about maybe the stories that you have to tell.
My family's like
Because
been there
if you
like
don't tell
forever.
your
So when
story-
we were on the highway of Old Spanish Trail, we thought
If you don't
when
tell
the
your
plant
story,
offered to
who
buy it,
will? You are the expert of your life. And this became the mantra of the Oral History Project in Mossville, Louisiana, as you can see by the bookmark that says, "Today I told my story." And this is the bookmark that everyone received upon completing their oral history interview. The first steps in the journey to the Mossville Oral History Project started in the late 90s and early 2000s with a project on women environmentalists in Louisiana. And one of the people that was interviewed was Deborah Ramirez. And this is the first I had heard of Mossville, Louisiana. So I'd like for you guys to listen to her story as she talks about growing up with the impacts of industry in Mossville.
my family's like been there like forever. So when we were on the highway of Old Spanish Trail, we thought when the plant offered to buy us, and before they offered to buy my parents, by the way, I want you to know this. This is something that's very important to know. When the plant, it was a coke plant there. My mom went to the doctor and he asked her, did she smoke? She didn't smoke, but she had stuff in her lung. And he also asked her about her, respiratory problems and stuff. So we'd been having problems with the plant early on because I remember when it would explode, we didn't have an alarm but the whistle to go off, but the police would come in. I say police, but the sheriffs would come and they would tell us to hurry up and get out. And we ran. Sometimes we were in our sleeping clothes, barefooted. And we were running Old Spanish Trail where gators were. They had gators in there. They had moccasins crossing the road because don't forget, we talking about swampland. And we would run to the corner of the old Truesdale Road and we would stand there and wait for the all clear for us to go home. So when we went back home, we would go back home. We got to the point to where we were sleeping in our clothes. That way, if the plant exploded, we would be caught with our sleeping clothes on. Little girls had little nightgowns sometimes that were thin. We didn't have time to even grab a house coat. So we got to the point where we would just sleep in our clothes. And that's how often this plant would always blow up, we would call it. And also remember, too, that when we would get back home and had to go to school the next morning, sometimes we would be very tired. And I don't know if we really were comprehending the things that we needed to comprehend even at Mossville, because it was just always a constant struggle.
I hope you got the basic gist of that. That was Deborah talking about the difficulties of growing up in Mossville, Louisiana, and some of the things that she dealt with as a child. So there's a lot to unpack there. I think you heard her talk about the buyouts that Condé Vista started, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But again, there's a lot to unpack there. We've got environmental racism, we've got intergenerational trauma. There's a lot of that there. So, but first, I want to talk a little bit about what is oral history.
My family.
So oral history is the creation of, when you do an oral history, you end up creating a primary source. And that primary source ends up in a repository where it is accessible and available and discoverable and preserved in perpetuity for researchers long after we're gone. And what makes oral history a little bit different than other types of interviews is this concept of shared authorship. So for example, if I were to interview Steve Beck as a journalist, no offense to journalism, but if I were to interview Steve about the history of Science Café, Steve would be my source, and it would be my story that I was telling as a journalist. If I'm interviewing Steve about the history of Science Café as an oral historian, we're co-owners. He's a co-owner of that oral history. So joint authorship, co-ownership of the story is baked into the process the entire way through. So it's in the informed consent, it's in the copyright release, it's in the transcription review. We want to make sure that narrators have an equal partnership in the interview process as we both try to create something that lasts the test of time. And part of the other thing about oral histories that's different is that we do life narratives. So we interview people about their whole life story in order to provide cultural context for the thing that we're interviewing them about. So next slide. Steve already mentioned a little bit about the center, but I'll just briefly describe it. So we were founded in 1991 to collect and preserve first-person narratives about Louisiana culture and history that's in people's heads and no place else. This is something that T. Harry Williams said. T. Harry Williams won a Pulitzer Prize for his oral history work on Huey P. Long. And so it was in the spirit of T. Harry's work that the center was founded in order to document through multiple perspectives, stories about Louisiana culture and history that can help fill in the gaps of the stories that are generally left out of mainstream society. We're not a very big staff. There's no way we would have 6,500 hours of interview or 6,500 interviews if it weren't for working and collaborating with community members. So next slide. So some of the people with whom we collaborate are university community members. And you can see some of the topics here over the years that people, sorry, that's the wrong, not the right side. But let me just back up and say that the reason that we partner with community members is because y'all are the experts in your topic, in your story, in your life, in your field. And we are just the infrastructure. We provide the expertise on the infrastructure to help make sure that we provide best practices and preservation to make sure that those stories are preserved in perpetuity. Next slide. Yeah, so university history. These are some of the projects that we've worked with over the years, some of the partners with whom we've worked. You can see some of those topics. Next slide. Beyond the gates of LSU. These are some of the partners all across the state of Louisiana with whom we've worked. So again, you can kind of see a theme here. People in the state are interested in preserving stories about African-American culture, LGBTQ+ culture, coastal changes, the things that are going on our coast, Native American culture. So again, we listen to you, we partner with you. And so next slide. The steps on the journey to the Mossville Oral History Project began actually, the early seeds were planted in 1998, 2000s for the project with Peggy Franklin. And there were 48 people interviewed 40 women about their work in the environmental movement in the 70s through the 1990s. And so by the time the book was published in 2013, next slide, in 2014, when Susan Reed of the Imperial Calcasieu Museum called us and said, hey, I just read Peggy Franklin's book and I need help on an oral history project. Let me tell you, this happens all the time where people are like, hey, I heard about this from so-and-so, and can you help us with this oral history project? And so this was not a surprise to me. When she went on to explain that Mossville community was in a crisis, essentially there was very little time to document the history of a community that was undergoing vast changes because of dislocation and industrial expansion, that we needed to do this. We needed to get to work on this project as quickly as possible to preserve some of the history in the region. And so Susan had grant funding, and this helped expedite the process because a lot of times we rely on volunteers and that can take a really long time. So we're very fortunate to have a grant funded project. And so the field work took between, I want to say 2015 through 2017, where 70 people were interviewed and the interviews were processed and made available through repositories. And so everyone has access to those interviews now. Next slide. So the Mossville Oral History Project would not be possible without the help of the Mossville Steering Committee. And the Imperial Calcasieu Museum got this committee together. It was Kim McKee, Butch Lamel, Vera Payne, and Della Dotson. We met regularly. We discussed research. We exchanged research. They helped us identify narrators, and in particular, vulnerable narrators. So maybe somebody who's old, up in age, or somebody who's not well, or maybe somebody's coming into town to go to a family reunion, and we better get their story as soon as we can. So they were very instrumental in that, helped spread the word about the project, and helped us most of all with oral history days. And that's the video you kind of see on the loop. We did 4 oral history days, which were about 4 hours. We had them at the Rig Maiden Culture Center and a church nearby, whereby the Imperial Calcasieu Museum, with whom we partnered, had a scanning table where people would bring memorabilia and have it scanned. And then we had oral history booths where people would come in and tell 15-minute, 20-minute stories about their lives in Louisiana. So we got to listen to what was important to people and then build on that and do deeper research on that. And also people got to see and feel what it was like to tell their story. So that was pivotal. And again, we could not have done it without the community. They were out there, passing out leaflets, going door to door to help people, be involved in this project. So the partnership on our part was we were being very mindful of the mindset of researchers coming in to document a culture, right? Because there is this sort of history of private universities and land grant universities swooping in, parachuting in, getting their, doing research, potentially exploiting a community, and then out they go, never to be seen again. So we wanted to make sure that we were being as equal partners as we possibly could. And to that end, and this idea that oral histories give voice, that we're giving voice, we're not giving voice. People have voices. We're just making sure that they're, recorded and in a repository. And so to that end, the oral histories are in several repositories all over, especially in that area. And we also trained people how to do oral histories to document their own communities. So what did we know and what did we want to know? And this timeline sort of outlines that. So you can kind of see that Mossville started as Shoats Prairie in the 1790s, 1850s, founded by free people of color. And it started off as an agricultural community, moved into logging. Everything was clear cut. There was a sulfur mine actually at one point in time, which is why Sulphur, Louisiana is named Sulphur, Louisiana, which is where Mossville is a sort of suburb of Sulphur, which is a suburb of Lake Charles, Louisiana. And after the railroad came in, 1934 is the first chemical industry plant to be there. And then comes the an oil refinery in 1938, 1939, through World War II. Industries encircle Mossville, Louisiana. And this also meant that work was plentiful. So a lot of people moved to Mossville, Louisiana in search of work. And Mossville sort of became, this is stuff that we learned through the oral histories, Mossville became a safe haven during a Jim Crow, very racist Jim Crow era for African Americans to be. Over and over again, we heard this in the interviews with Mossville being a safe haven during the Jim Crow era. There was a canteen, there was a drugstore, there was a post office, there were schools, people gathered to share music, food, and most of all, community and family ties. And so this is what we looked for when we went into, with this lens, we sort of went into the communities and asked people questions about these topics. And so next slide, you got to remember too, that it wasn't until really like Love Canal in the 1970s and 80s that people became aware, like there became a consciousness about the side effects of industry. So in the 40s and 50s, the town grew because there was work, but what happened in the 70s and 80s is people started, you can kind of see things are happening in tandem back here. You've got toxic emissions, you've got dumping, and it's not just in Mossville. Willow Springs had some illegal dumping going on as well. And then you also have testing going on. You had people coming in and testing the water, the soil, the air, and even people's blood. So the dioxins were high in people's blood levels. Also in tandem with that, you have people organizing. So Mossville Environmental Action Now was formed in the late 80s. And then in tandem with that, our lawsuits are filed. And part of the settlement of some of the lawsuits are Condé Vista, who's later bought by Sasol, started with a buyout program to buy people out of their houses. And then Sasol picked that up in 2001 when they bought Condé Vista. And then in 2012, when Sasol wanted to expand their facilities into where Mossville residents live, this is when the buyouts were amped up, and in order to create a fracking facility. So we came in around 2015 after this had kind of started, and with an oral history lens, we were trying to look at this and explore all of these things. So the culture, the environment, activism, local history, we're trying to explore all of that. And so next slide. This is what people shared with us, and this is what people explored. So we got all kinds of stories about Old Spanish Trail, the history and lore behind living on one of the oldest roads in the United States, Old Spanish Trail. People talked about looking for treasure as children. We got information, people shared information about what was important to them. So church, education, family. There's a lot of information there about a sense of place names named after families. There's a lot of information about living off the land and farming and gardening and fishing, so the ties to the land in there. And people do share information too about Jim Crow South, into the forced integration. And then also information was shared about what's going on now, actually. So together, people from the communities, the people in the community who came forward to share their stories, talked about the subjects that we just described. The end result were 70 interviews, over 100 hours of interviews. And this is a digital library, essentially, where all of them are available. You can look at them, you can read them. There's transcriptions, there's summaries. That's one of the summaries right there, and the verbatim transcriptions, the audio. So you no longer have to go to a repository to kind of find these. There are copies of this at the Rigmaiden Culture Center, the Imperial Calcasieu Museum, the Calcasieu Parish Public Library, and McNeese State University. And everybody who was interviewed also received a copy of their interview. And another part, next slide, of the end result was an exhibition, an exhibit in a gallery. So Imperial Calcasieu Museum, the people with whom we partnered, they built a wing onto the museum, a gallery wing, to house some of the artifacts that Mossville community members shared. And then part of that was a listening station. So in this listening station, there's over 70 clips talking about history, culture, economy, and a lot of information in there. There's a couple of hours of things to peruse through here if you would like. And this is, for example, this clip right here is someone talking about leaving Mossville during Jim Crow and going to a segregated restaurant right outside of Mossville. What a different experience that was compared to living in Mossville, where things were not segregated because it was an all African-American community. And this is a clip from Hockey Vincent. He's one of the people who is active in the activism to fight for better air, land, and water as well. So you can go in yourself. The URL code is up there, as is the QR code if you'd like to visit it yourself. And next slide. So we're not going to play the audio. You want to try? Okay.
My grandmother and her sisters, they all live. Aunt Minerva was her sister. She lived to be 100 and
I know, as I mentioned to you earlier, how,
Okay, so you can read along.
like
That's the brilliant part about having a transcription.
on what the moved itself did to me. And
Joanna
affected me.
Mayo Huntsberry
And,
talks
I
here
wrote a
about the
book on that, and I
importance
posted it
of
on Facebook.
and the connection to the land. And you can kind of infer from that how people also may have gotten sick when the land, air, and water was polluted. But she talks about basic rural life ways where people had their own gardens, chickens, livestock, orchards, and that sort of thing. So I invite you to listen to that when you get a chance. And the next slide. In every interview, we asked people, what does Mossville mean to you? And we also asked people who were leaving, who did not participate in the buyout program, what does leaving Mossville mean to you? And Teresa Lee tells this very moving story. And I invite you to read along, read it. Take a second to read it. So as you can see from that quote, there are challenges, and the challenges were inherent in this oral history project. And one of the big ones was that the community was in crisis and potentially even experiencing trauma from moving in such a quick period, in such a short period of time, and all of the grief and all of the loss that is associated with losing a community that has been around for centuries, that was founded by free people of color, that was a safe haven during Jim Crow, and that has essentially almost fallen to environmental racism. So there's a crisis occurring here, and this definitely impacts the way the Oral History Project happened. And so the other thing that was a challenge, we were up against a clock. We had very little time to do this project, and we were so fortunate that so many people agreed to sit down and talk to us. The other things always, politics are always going to be a challenge. And it's funny because I was expecting politics of, you know, industry, economy, buyouts, not buyouts. What I wasn't expecting was the interpersonal politics between some of the community members. So for example, if we were like paying close attention to one family, but not close attention to another, that sort of thing. Those kind of politics were a bit of a surprise and manifested themselves. But in the end, all of that really sort of played together so that everybody really did try, a lot of people really did try to tell their stories. Then of course there were trust issues, right? Rightly so. Here we are, an oral history project. It's got this name Sasol stamped on it. And this is nothing against Sasol. Sasol was very hands off. the funding came through the Imperial Catholic Museum. They said, hey, what's this oral history thing? We explained it to them and then really didn't, that's pretty much what happened. They did not there was no, thanks to Office of Sponsored Research, thanks to the way the grant was written. I mean, they really were very supportive of, hey, you get whatever story. We don't even care if it's ugly. We are very invested in making sure that Mossville history is preserved. But you can understand why there would be trust issues, right? Like an oral history day, and then there's the Sasol logo. So anybody, in the process of participating in a buyout, people who didn't want to participate in the buyouts, there's just going to be an implied issue there, potentially, not for everyone, obviously, but there definitely were trust issues, and I definitely understand that. Next slide. So the lessons from this project are, number one, having a plan works. In 2014, when Susan Reed called me up and said, hey, can we do this quickly? I sat down, sketched out a plan, and essentially stuck to that plan and the best practices that go along with oral history. And there were even, this was the core, this is what we stuck with to ride it through. The other thing is, and now I know this so much better than I did at the time, if I had to do this project again, I would definitely incorporate an element of crisis-informed or trauma-informed lens on this project. If I could go back and do that again, I would definitely do that. And so what does that look like? Number one, partnering with experts, right? So maybe somebody from from the LSU College of Education Counseling Department to train interviewers on how to look for a crisis, how to see people in crisis, what not to do, how to see people who may be going through trauma. And if somebody does become, as Stephanie likes to say, unzipped, make sure to give people a space to zip back up. But not just that, not just training interviewers on not traumatizing someone, but also going in with resources. And this again, if I knew what I know now, what I knew then, I would have pushed back to Susan and have her push back to Sasol and say, hey, increase the funding by this much money, and let's make sure that we go in there with resources for crisis intervention. And by that, I mean having resources available for narrators to get additional help and get additional support, and have it be longitudinal as well, and have it be free. And that's not only for the narrators, but also for the interviewers, because there is the possibility of interview after interview and of stories of grief and loss and sickness and death. There's a possibility for compassion fatigue and burnout and that sort of thing. So again, if I could go back, this is one big thing that I would change. And then I would also incorporate a longitudinal component to this, and that we would go back in 10 years and do interviews again. So those are the lessons to be learned. Next. Benefits. So the benefits of this project was looking at it from a historic preservation lens, getting interviews with people about Louisiana, about Mossville culture and history, because Mossville is not the same. There's less than 195 people left in the area. When we were there were less than 500 people left. So if through a cultural and historical preservation lens, this was one of the benefits of this project. The other benefit was the opportunity to explore community memories. People were able to get together through the oral history days, through the community steering committee, through other events that were held, and people got an opportunity to explore history and co-author their history. And this can be very empowering. And the other thing is a foundation for the future, not just continuing to look and do research on Mossville, Louisiana, but on how we do oral history, how we incorporate oral history into projects like this. So for example, I'll just throw two examples out there. Claire Kelsey, the Rochester Institute for Technology, recently used for her master's thesis, looked at all of these interviews and did her Master of Science thesis on environmental racism and systemic racism and how it manifests in Louisiana communities, but especially Mossville. And she used these oral histories, and I'm very grateful that she was able to incorporate this information into her research. And then we recently worked with Jennifer Richmond Bryan, Matilda Otero, Jen Irving, and several other people, NC State, to look at Colfax, Louisiana, and the toxic air emissions there. And they replaced focus groups. They were doing air emission tests, but they replaced focus groups with oral history instead and used that as a methodology. And that article recently was published in Local Environment through Taylor and Francis. So again, it's a foundation for the future. So again, I'd like to conclude this part of the talk, but I'd also like to invite you to think about your stories and what you know and what you're the expert on in your fields and your life and your culture and your history and what it is that you would like to share. And think about sharing it. Think about doing your own oral history project, because if you don't tell your story, no one else will. Thank you. Questions? Paul. Okay, so the question was about crises and the nature of the crises, and we talked about potentially, if we had to do it over again, look at it through a crisis-informed lens. So I think the big crisis was essentially the dislocation and relocation in the time period that it was occurring in, and how quickly that was happening, and that essentially that was the big crisis that we were able to see on a daily basis. I mean, we would go back and there would be bulldozers, and there were like a house was there last week, it's there no more. So the changes that people were going through on a rapid, I mean, an entire community was dismantled and not necessarily relocated together. Some people went to Houston, some people went to, Sulphur, some people went to Lake Charles, some people went to California. So he's asking if people were trained better in crisis management, what could they have done? Well, the first thing we would do, I think, is just bring in an expert in crisis management. And I wouldn't put the onus on the interviewer to be a crisis responder, just more like to notice if someone is in crisis or if someone is experiencing trauma, to one, not re-traumatize them, because the act of telling a story within the first 90 days of a crisis can actually re-traumatize and affect someone for a long term. So number one, to not re-traumatize or exploit people for a story. And so the other thing would be to just be able to pass on the resources and in a way that you're not chasing a problem, that you come prepared for that problem. And so bringing experts in on how to do that. Okay. Okay, so the question was, what kind of feedback have we received from the narrators themselves about the project? So, in the beginning, when the exhibit first opened, people came who were interviewed for the project, and it came to the gallery, and there was kind of a ceremony to honor the narrators who came. And so that feedback was very positive. There's something very moving and powerful about the opportunity to tell your story, especially in the way that oral history is structured. Again, it's like an hour-and-a-half interview, open-ended questions, and a lot of listening and follow-up questions. So it's really the narrator's opportunity to sort of guide that interview. So the initial response was, we wanted, essentially thank you. People are happy to participate in it. And the responses that we've received later was that I think there needs to be follow-up interviews to continue that. So I don't think this sort of thing doesn't need to be over. Yes. Thank you for that question. I appreciate it. So the question was, have I had an opportunity to share with colleagues my concerns about trauma and crisis and how it affects narrators and with the rest of the oral history community? As a matter of fact, I did write an essay that was published in the Oral History Review called First Do No Harm. And it's about, like, hold on, before we go into the field in an ongoing crisis, in an ongoing trauma, let's think about this. And here's why we should think about it. And so since that, I had 4 weeks to conceptualize and publish an article, and I'm never doing that again as long as I live. But it was a really good opportunity, and it did get a dialogue going, because I'd been thinking about it since Hurricane Katrina. People, like, I got a call from somebody, a newspaper reporter, in between Katrina and Rita, and he said, "Why aren't you out there doing oral histories?" And I said, "Why aren't you? You're the journalist." We had people in our house were people who had left New Orleans staying in our house. We had family things going on. I was like, this is not a time to do oral history. So I've been thinking about it a lot since then. And this was the first opportunity I had to really sit down and do research on the intersection of trauma and oral history. And yeah, it would definitely change the way I approach this project. And I hope, being able to share that with other oral historians will help inform that. And I've done a couple conference presentations too. There is, and we're doing one for the SSA in August. So that'll be a webinar with archivists and oral historians as well. Thank you for that question. Any other questions? Yes. Okay, he asked what the genesis for this project was. Essentially, is my understanding that there was a community steering committee in Mossville, Louisiana, and there was discussion of historic preservation of the community, and someone wanted to bring an oral history element into that. And that's, again, that's where Susan called up and said, "Hey, I know you do this. Can you help us do this?" Yes. Kelly. That's such a great question. And that's one of those things that I've pondered since. And so the question was, do you think you had an equal amount of people who were interviewed who were staying and people who were leaving? And the answer is no. We definitely mostly interviewed people who were leaving. I think, again, this is part of the problem, part of the politic part and the trust issue. I think it was people who were staying were not sharing. And again, if I could go back, I might have pushed that a little bit harder. The good news is, the balancing part of that is there have been several documentaries and several investigations where people who did stay have been interviewed. I think When Great Trees Fall is one documentary. I forget the names of the others, but there are definitely some perspectives. There are a lot of recorded perspectives out there. Any other questions? Yes. So the question is, if somebody wants to collaborate on an oral history project, what's the best way to approach y'all for that collaboration? And essentially, you just call us up and you say, I have an idea for a project, and then we'll meet and we have a whole project planning decision tree that we go down. So again, if you already know what you're doing and you know where you want to go, we'll just write you a letter of support for your grant that you're applying for. If you are like, I have no idea what oral history is, then we will roll up our sleeves and do some best practices training and, maybe even train you on how to, conduct oral histories, loan equipment out and that sort of thing. What you need to bring, again, you're the expert, right? So the thing that you need to bring is a genuine interest. And, again, too, what we're looking for is things about Louisiana culture and history that are underdocumented, like these stories that are out there in the ether. And you're like, you should really tell this story. these are the stories that we want to hear. So again, we try to help in any way that we can. A lot of times we rely on your interest and your willingness, or someone you know's willingness to be a volunteer for that project. And like, look, it took Peggy, it took her 15 years. And there was a committee and there were volunteer interviewers and all of that. And it still takes a while. So patience and interest. Thank you for your question. Stanley. So Stanley wants to know so the question is, was Sasol interested in the results? They were interested in the results. They were, to me, my interpretation was, we sent a quarterly report like, hey, this is how many people have been interviewed. I think their goal was to try and interview as many people, especially the elders, who had information about cultural traditions that were going to disappear as the community disappeared. So they definitely expressed interest. What I meant by that, and I should probably clarify, is they weren't like, oh, you better not say, like, you better not let people tell that story. They weren't, there was just a real hands-off of understanding that challenging, difficult, embarrassing, ugly potential stories would be told. And they were very supportive of making sure that people had a space to tell those stories. So they were interested in the outcome. They wanted as many people to feel a buy-in as possible. So the question is, can projects like this help other corporations doing similar types of things? So full disclosure, I'm an anthropologist by training. I cut my teeth in the world of archaeology, historical archaeology. That's how I started oral history, was in the field of historical archaeology. And so I have always been a proponent that oral history should be part of the cultural impact study component of any sort of project that's getting funding, if it's at all possible. So yes, I do think oral history should be folded in any way possible. Whenever there's a road being built, whenever any sort of earth is moved or community is impacted, whenever there's a cultural impact, I would love it if oral history was involved in that. So thank you for that question. Yes, you in the back. So the question is, is this project sort of a new thing, and what new insights did it provide? And also, did it potentially provide a pathway or a lens to look at other communities? And I would say that the oral history component did provide a lot of information about the history of Mossville and in a lot of stories that weren't known before in regards to very specific cultural things, right? And so stories were unearthed in that way about, so for example, establishments that are there no more, people who are there, people who were leaders, people who, the school and the stories of like forced integration and that sort of thing. So yes, the oral history is definitely, I don't think these stories are recorded and available in other ways. There has been a lot of focus on Mossville from documentary filmmakers and investigative reporters for sure. So there's a lot of stories out there about Mossville. And then to your other question about other communities going through the same thing, I would say yes. And again, I think Peggy Franklin's work back in the late 90s, early 2000s, she focused on women who were involved in the environmental movement. And that also meant that there was a focus on the towns and the communities. And several of them were African-American communities who had very similar plights, very similar pathways as Mossville. So I encourage you to read that book to look at that. But yes, I think that there's a lens I think that this definitely can help with the lens. And again, Claire Kelsey's theses are really good. She starts pulling in other communities like Donaldsonville, for example. So there's definitely thinking in that direction. So thank you for that question. Any other questions? Yes. Now you're asking me, okay, so he's asking me about Old Spanish Trail. So I really, I should have studied this before I came up here, but the Old Spanish Trail is a really old road that goes from Florida to somewhere out west. And yeah, that's really, I'm not going to pretend like I know much about it. I did when I first started this project, but I have a very small hard drive, so I can only store so much information in there. But it's really fascinating, and I'll be like driving in another state and I'll see Old Spanish, I'll see like a sign, a vestige of Old Spanish Trail, and I think it's neat. Sorry, I don't know if anybody else wants to answer that question, a historian or something. No, not you. Okay. Steve. So Steve's question is, what about anthropology was I able to bring to the field of oral history? So there were two projects that I was doing, or so I was trained as a cultural anthropologist, but you know where the money is, right? Like when you graduate from graduate school and you have debts to pay, I was like, okay, I'll just do archaeology and get the bills paid. And I had taken some archaeology classes and done some digs. And I'd also done some ethnographic field work. I did a field school for ethnographic field work. And so we had Shauna Walton was the ethnographer, and she's at Nicholls State now. Carolyn Ware, who's at LSU right now, was the folklorist, and she came in and trained us. We had a photographer, we had a husband-wife photographer that trained us. Then we had a historian. Oh my gosh, he's gonna kill me. Chuck. I can't remember his last name. Bolton, Charles Bolton was a historian. So we were trained in all of these avenues on how to collect oral histories. But again, I had done some cultural anthropology training, ethnographic fieldwork, participant observation and that sort of thing. And there are different types of interviews, but I was in the Bahamas working for an LSU project, actually, under Dr. Paul Farnsworth and Lori Wilkie. And we were looking at some British loyalist ruins that actually had Taino ruins underneath them. And so all that to say, but when we were investigating the archaeological component, there were a lot of old people around. And I was like, and the people were like, I wonder how they used this for this. And I'd be like, well, we could just ask the old people. I don't know. We could draw some analogies. And I mean, like there were like 110-year-old people in the Bahamas at the time that we were there. And so that was one way. And then another way was in Natchez, Mississippi, the same thing. We were looking at a plantation. We were looking at enslaved house ruins, and also the yard area, so the space there. And right next to it is adjacent community with people who were descendants of the people who had been enslaved in that area. And there was a lot of questions about, like, I wonder how this garden was planted here. I wonder, who did the work in the gardens, that sort of thing. We're looking at gender and that sort of thing. And I was like, well, there's a 103-year-old person living right there who's going to have stories of what their moms and grandmas was. So they said, okay, here's a recorder. You go do the interviews and you go talk to the older people about what was going on that they can remember. And maybe we can kind of piece some of this stuff together. And that's what I did my thesis on. And then my husband came to graduate school here, and I knocked on the door of the TROM Center and I said, hey man, I can do interviews. Can you hire me? And that's how I got here. So any other questions? Yes. So the question is about why the Mossville School had to close. And this reminds me that I forgot to say something that was really important, and I always do. But Mossville was not incorporated, meaning Mossville didn't have a mayor, Mossville didn't have a city council. And so Mossville didn't have a lot of representation when it came to big decisions that Calcasieu Parish made. And so when integration, there are no pleasant stories about integration from either the teachers or the students who were forced to integrate into Westlake and the community nearby. And so yeah, that part and the legacy of that not being incorporated trickles down to later on when big decisions were being made about industry and industrialization and land use and zoning and that sort of thing as well. There was a police juror, but it's not the same thing as having a mayor. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know. You'd be a great interviewer. She's like, why did the school have to close? People just said the schools had to close, and the teachers who taught at Mossville Elementary and Mossville High School had to go to teach at Westlake, and the students had to go teach and had to go to Westlake. And there's just really, Christine Bennett tells a really moving story, and it's on the exhibit as well, about her first day of going to school and how they begged their parents, why can't they come here? Why can't they come here? And you can see how it made Christine who she is. She ends up working with Mossville Environmental Action now and being a staunch advocate for environmental equity. Yes. So the question is, if Mossville had been incorporated, maybe the industrialization couldn't have proliferated as much as possible. I don't know. That's a what if. That's a time machine. Like, I don't have to go back and see, but I definitely think it's talked about a lot in the interviews. We didn't have an official mayor. We didn't have an official representative, and it contributes. Claire Kelsey talks a lot about this in her thesis as well, how it contributes to slow violence, right? And a buildup. Lack of representation. The narratives in the Mossville about having a safe haven. Again, this word is used over and over and over again about people being educated and in Mossville and going on to go to college and go out into the community and go out into the world and do these amazing things. And people were so proud of the Mossville community members and the legacy. So yeah, there's a lot of, you can see that in the interviews, that there's a lot of negativity around that integration. I see you over there. Okay, thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you. Let's a big round of applause for Jen Cramer. This is really great work that they do. It's important because it's not just about giving people voice. It's really about documenting history from a first person perspective. And it's really important that we document all of this history. So thank you for all the work that you're doing. I'm sure you're all dying to know who the winner of this lovely cup is. Flo Ulmer. Flo, come here. Here it is. Come on. Congratulations. Usually Allison Satake is here, and she runs out and into the audience and gives away the award, but she's not here today, so that's okay. She'll be here. She'll be with us soon. So we hope that you join us next month on July 26th for a Science Cafe talk with a true university treasure, Dr. Jinx Coleman Broussard, who's going to be talking about Black journalists and their fight for freedom and equity and parity. And it's going to be a great, great talk. I hope you're there with us. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for those of you online who were able to watch us, and we'll see you next month. Thank you very much.